Okay, good afternoon, class, and welcome back to the Investigating Language in Art, Invention, and Inspiration. Just a brief repeat of what I mentioned last time about assessment for any of you who might be joining this week for the first time. And just to go over again the ideas of what we will be doing. Continuous participation, I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. We will have an open book midterm test, a term paper, 20%, and an open book final exam. There is an exam, 40%. Both the midterm test and the final exam are both open book. They are more essay type of questions that you will be asked. I have uploaded to Canvas for your information the assignments and the test questions for both the midterm and the final exam. I've uploaded that to Canvas in week one folder. And so you can get an idea of the kinds of questions that might be asked and have an idea of what might be covered in the exam. But again, I would just make that point that of course they won't be the same questions, all right? So, but just to give you some idea of what you could expect. And just also for everyone to remind you, be sure to look in the quizzes, and in the quizzes you'll notice that there is first of all the survey, getting to know you, and the survey itself, remember, please do this. Really only about half of you have done it so far, and I'd really appreciate it if you just would take some time to do that today. And I'll give you a bit of time toward the end of the lesson, and I'd appreciate it if you just go through it, and it's very quick, just some questions that let me get to know you better and let me know who's in the class. All right, so please just do this. It's not assessed. I'm not marking you on it, but it would be useful and helpful to me. So I appreciate it if you do it. This, though, is assessed, all right, the quiz, all right, metaphor and language. Now, as I mentioned, you have 20% is by continuous participation, and that includes tasks like this. There will be 4 of them, and they are worth 5 points each, and it's a really rather short task. It gives you possible questions. In this case, it was 150, 200 words on one of these questions, all right? How is your understanding of metaphor similar or different from my explanation? In the language of science, I believe I have another slide here, yes. In the language of science, verbs are often turned into nouns. Why are nouns favored over verbs in the language of science? And how is poetry like music? And does our use of language reflect the way we think? One of these, answer one of these, 150, 200 words. And that's all that the task involves. And this is going to be due, as I mentioned, 14th of September. All right, so please be sure to do that. It counts, and it's a very easy way for you to earn points, especially within this continuous participation assessment, all right? Now, there are 4 tasks that will be like this. This is the first one. Again, each one of them will be 5 points, and each of them will be of the same nature. I'll give you some questions based on what we've covered in lecture, and I'll ask you to write 150 to 200 words. All right, so that's the continuous participation, and that's the task I'm asking you to do by Friday, the 14th of September. Okay. All right, so today what I'd like to do is, because of the ad drop, and there are a number of you that have come into the class that weren't here last week, I will review last week's lecture a bit. All right, okay, not a whole lot, but I'll cover some points as sort of a background to what we'll be talking about today. And today we'll be beginning to look at what I call verbal art. And we'll be taking a look at some examples of verbal art. And we'll see how far we get through today. And what we don't cover today, we will continue to look at next week. All right, so let me quickly mention some points that I mentioned last week. Linguistics. The approach in this course is from linguistics. And linguistics, we would say, is the scientific study of language. Excuse me. Now, in terms of linguistics, there are different models, there are different theories, different approaches that have been taken in linguistics, and two linguists that stand out with very different points of view. One is M.A.K. Halliday, and the other is Noam Chomsky. Now, Chomsky, on the one hand, he believes that our linguistic ability derives from an innate competence. We're born with the ability to use language. Not just that, in the sense that what we're born with is this sort of logical structuring, grammar within us. And it's logically well ordered and can be described as such, must be described as such. But we know very well that language tends to be fuzzy, indeterminate. That's how we actually use language. To try to apply a logical structuring to language sometimes poses problems. But Chomsky's point is that whatever problems do arise and make it difficult to apply a particular logical structure to what we're describing, well, those are just the results of performance constraints. They're irrelevant. It's just your misspeaking. Halliday takes a very different point of view, and that's the point of view that we're going to be adopting here. And that is that the way that we use language, how do we use language? Ideationally. How we construe the world, our experience. Interpersonally, to relate to others, to enact social relationships. In the actual usage of language, it is inherently fuzzy. But in fact, you see, that is what allows for this creativity in language. It isn't a performance constraint. It isn't just misspeaking. In fact, the ambiguity in language, the indeterminacy in language, the fuzziness in language is what allows for the creativity in language. Now, Chomsky, on the one hand, he sees the history of how we have come to how our cultures develop, how our languages develop. It's intrusive, it's untidy, it's irrational, and it's upsetting the logical purity of the language system that we're innately inborn with. We're going to take a very different point of view here. We are interested in the history and how we've gotten where we are and where we might be headed in terms of our language and how it's changing and how it's evolving. You see, language has a purpose. Our purpose is to make meaning. And make meaning, what does that mean, to make meaning? It's the choices that you make. And the way we use language, we're going to call that the text. All right? And by text, I don't mean just like a book or a written text. That's very often what we think of when we say text. What we mean by text here is the instances of our use of language. And really, our use of language is based on choices. A text is a semantic structure, meaningful. It's formed out of a continuous process of choice among innumerable, yes, infinite. We cannot know the sort of the range of options that we have to choose from among. And the choices are innumerable, interrelated sets of semantic options. And what we mean by these sets of options, all right, we're going to call these sets the functions of language, the meta functions of language, different aspects, purposes to which we put language. One purpose we've mentioned, construing experience, how we understand the world around us. We said we would call this the ideational meta function of language. How we enact relationships, because we use language to relate to people. Right? We don't just talk about what's happening. We don't just talk about what we're feeling. The way we talk is intended to exchange that information with others and relate to others. We'll call that the interpersonal. We create the discourse. All right, so think of it like this. You are construing the world, your experience of the world. That's meaning. Meaning is basically invisible. All right, it's open to question what it means, right? Meaning, what do I mean? How do you understand what I mean? It's not visible until we make it visible, until we turn our ideas, until we turn our intentions into the text itself. We create the discourse, and we will call that the textual. So language, Halliday says, is more than a semiotic system. It's more than just a system of meaning, because we have many meaningful systems. I mentioned previously that, I mean, if you're driving in this, the traffic lights is a semiotic system. Red, stop. Green, go. Yellow, caution. But what makes language different? What makes language different? It is that it is a system that makes meaning. How do you make meaning? By making choices. The choices that you can, what you can say, as opposed to what you're not going to, how you're not going to say it. That's a choice. That is making meaning. And so what we said was that any language has these three meta functions to be able to construe the world, our experience. We're going to be more specific. We're going to call that the experiential subcomponent of the ideational meaning, because ideational also includes the logical, how you combine those ideas, how you expand on what you're saying. And the interpersonal, enacting your social relationships and how you exchange that information with others, and then how that meaning becomes materialized in the text, in the exchange of meaning, whether written or spoken. It doesn't matter the medium. And what enables then this meaning-making potential in language is the grammar. Halliday calls it the lexicogrammar. What he means by that is that it's not like we have two things, words here, grammar here. It's really one thing, all right? It's the wording. Think of it like that. You have meaning and you have wording. And what Halliday is saying is thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. You can't think about meaning without thinking about the wording. And so when we talk about the wording, What are we saying? What do we mean? Well, how do you construe the world? How do you understand the world? What kinds of processes are taking place? How do you describe it in terms of whether it's an action or whether it's a state of mind, whether it's some abstract relation? I have something. That's a relation. All right. Processes. Who initiates those processes? Who's affected by those processes? What are the circumstances under which that situation unfolded? What we notice in language is that there seems to be sort of a default way of being able to align meaning with wording. A default kind of alignment. And so we say things are nouns. Qualities are adjectives. Processes are verbs, and so on, right? That's the default. Halliday calls that the relation of congruence. We illustrated this with an example like this. We said that, for example, the solvent tends to be drawn through the membrane into the solution, thus diluting it. Now, how have you described that happening? Drawing through. That's a process. Diluting. Okay, it's all being described, like we just said, in that very congruent way. When you're describing something that is a happening, you're using verbs to describe it. But then, in the next sentence, all of that happening, all those verbs have now been repackaged into a noun. Movement of the solvent across the membrane. We now see it as a something, turning a happening into a something. So taking that relation of congruence and realigning it so that things as nouns, relators as conjunctions, processes as verbs, we redraw the lines. We realign it. And so now a process becomes a noun, expressed as a noun. Drawing through, diluting, becomes movement. Now, when it becomes a noun, it takes on the qualities of, what did we call it last time? Nounness. What is a noun? A noun is a thing. And what is a thing? It has something which is, it has substance. It's concrete. It's real. And so what you're saying is that that verb, which is dynamic and subject to being changing, is changing all the time, or it's active, it now becomes static. It becomes a thing. We call this grammatical metaphor. And what Halliday is saying is that this way of being able to create grammatical metaphors becomes a means to innovate in language. This is a way to innovate, to be creative. And creative not just in terms of words, but in terms of structures of words, grammar. Traditionally, we think of metaphor as words. And I gave you the example last time. Tim is a rock, and you're assigning the qualities of rockness. That picture you're assigning to Tim. Well, that's usually what we think of metaphor. But here what we're saying is that you can take a property of some particular grammatical element, like a noun. And what you can do is you can apply that to another sort of grammatical element, a verb. Changing that verb into a noun gives that verb then the qualities of nounness. And I gave you the illustration of Donald Jung. You remember in that particular speech that he gave. Now, the emphasis that he made was this. He said that In the quote I mentioned last time, it's in his speech. We hear the echo of Emerson that things are in the saddle and ride mankind. We are not the masters of our fate. That's basically his message. It's basically the way he sees the world. Because when you look at the speech itself, what you realize is that the way he sees the world is doing, not being done by people, but by events, abstractions, institutions, the revolution, the event, the power of ideas, the idea. Things are in the saddle and ride mankind. He says that explicitly, but it's also, it permeates the way he speaks and the way he construes the world. How you construe the world, your ideology is coming through in the way you speak, without you probably even being that very much aware of it. The way you see the world is coming through in the choices that you are making. There was another aspect to his speech which I was interested in because it illustrated the idea of grammatical metaphor. You remember, he gave this sort of comparison here. And just to remind you, at one level, he said you can read that as a lesson on the need for humility. That those who seek to lead events must accept that often the event leads them. But at another level, it is the reminder of the power of ideas to movement, to action, well beyond the reach of those who had the ideas. Now, what did we say last time? If you remember, we noticed that these two, one level at this level, there's a difference, though. At one level, you can read that. Now, notice two aspects, two choices that he's made here. One is the verb, read. It's not like you're reading. In this sense, it's read, it's understand, right? And when you talk of it in this sense, it's understand as mental. It's what you perceive in your head. But there's another choice that he made here as well, can. It's what could we say? It is sort of qualified by the idea that it's a possibility. This is a possible way for you to see it. That's what he's saying. Not very powerful, not very strong. But in the other level, it is a reminder of the power of ideas. And notice here the choice that he didn't make. He didn't say it reminds us, in which case it would have been also mental. No. He changes reminds to a noun. He gives that verb to remind the quality of nounness. He turns it into a thing. It makes it concrete. It makes it real. It gives it substance. And he's saying that it is this. There's no qualification here. It's not a possibility. It is. So without probably us really thinking a great deal about it when we're listening to him, he is really very, what should I say, effectively communicating to us which idea he really favors. You can read it like this. On the other level, it is this. Now, this, we called it, what do we say that is? We said that when you turn a verb into a noun like that, you're giving it the qualities of nounness. What did we call it? We said it's a grammatical metaphor. A grammatical metaphor. Now, really, honestly, what I'm going to tell you is that this course is about the ability to make metaphor. That's it. Because that is the ability that makes language innovative in language, that give us the ability to be innovative. All right, so What is this ability to make metaphors? Where does it come from? Now, go back to this idea of history, and specifically the history of the development, our own developments, the way we develop, our ontogenetic growth, as an individual. So that if you look at, and Halliday did a study of this, he looked at the use of language by children, and age 1 to 2 years, yes, children have the ability to generalize. They can move beyond talking in terms of proper nouns, talking in terms of names of people, to referring to classes. Not only is it just saying mommy, daddy, there becomes a sense of this is a mommy, this is a daddy. Generalizing. This is the class to which these people belong to. That's generalization. They become common nouns. So you move into this ability to generalize. Age 1 to 2 years. This becomes an ability that we have in language. From age 4 to 6, the child is able to deal with abstractness. From concrete categories to abstract ones, making it's now possible to re-theorize in uncommon sense terms. This is big. You can talk about size. You see the idea in terms of that we can talk in terms of not just concrete categories, big and small. We can talk about an abstract one, size. And you moved into that around age 4 to 6. But notice the direction that we're going: generalizing, generalization, abstractness. We're becoming ever more abstract, right? It's in a direction of abstractness that we're moving. Our ability. But then we sort of seem to take a sidestep away from this sort of abstracting to metaphor. And we take those sort of congruent ways of thinking, those default ways of thinking, and we can change them. Now, why do we call this a non-linear step? Why do I say it's going in a different direction? How come? Isn't metaphor also a kind of abstraction? You're turning verbs into nouns. Isn't that also a kind of abstraction? Abstracting? You see the graphic on the side, and knights move. Now, Halliday describes this progression, 2 steps in one direction and a 3rd step aside. He likens it to the chess move, Western style chess, called the knight's move. The knight's move is this non-linear step, the development of a higher order of discourse construction. But Professor David Butt from Macquarie University says this abstraction needs to be distinguished from mere abstractness. Do you know what that means? Abstraction needs to be distinguished from mere abstractness. Abstracting leads, in fact, to the more concrete. This is paradoxical. You'll notice that when we in an effort to become more, to turn from generalization to abstraction, to as we move in that direction and we take another step to metaphor, in fact, when we turn the verbs into nouns, what we're doing is we're making the world, in fact, paradoxically, the more abstract we become, the more concrete the world becomes. That's why it's that non-linear step. It's the paradoxical. Now we compare that with with Russell Mears. And Russell Mears is Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Sydney. And in his book, The Poet's Voice in the Making of Mind, he talks about this idea of also a very similar notion to Halliday's. And that to me was fascinating, because you have two, really, I would say, great thinkers in their respective disciplines, sort of coming to the same sort of conclusion. And that's interesting when that happens. Now, in what sense is Mears talking? Well, it's not the same as Halliday's, but there's a similarity that we'll notice. First of all, you take a thing, and the direction that, first of all, we notice is that a child is able to have sort of what we call homologs. They're replicas. They're an exact copy of something. Now, the direction that we are going here is not abstraction, but pattern matching. From replica to resemble, a resemblance between what we're looking at and what the thing is. But it's always based on like, comparing like with like. It is comparing patterns. The third step, the nonlinear step to metaphor, it's pattern matching. Going from a comparison of like with like to like with unlike. Paradoxically perceiving similarity in something that is completely dissimilar. This is this ability to metaphorize, whether it's talking in terms of greater abstracting, leading to that nonlinear step, making it more concrete as we do, or whether it's comparing like with like and moving in a nonlinear step to comparing like with unlike. It's the paradoxical. What is the metaphorical? The metaphorical is the paradoxical. And what is metaphor? What is its purpose? The purpose is, I like, again, the quote I gave you last time, a metaphoric cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. It's almost like you're projecting a picture, you're projecting a movie, and in this, what you're projecting is this partially glimpsed, because we never really see everything, right? It's a partially glimpsed personal reality which we communicate through this ability to be metaphorical. And so we compare. Abstracting leading to the more concrete, Halliday's idea. Paradoxically, the more abstract the theorizing, the more concrete the world becomes. Mears' idea, pattern matching leading from comparison of like with like to like with unlike, paradoxically perceiving similarities in dissimilars. Point I want you to make, to take away from this is metaphor. It is the paradoxical. It is the non-linear step. It is the out-of-the-box thinking. What's the knight's move? Taking the non-linear step in the direction of the paradoxical. We looked at that in terms of verbal science. The idea that in verbal science, now we've just been talking about the history of the development of the individual's development, the ontogenetic development of the individual, leading it at one age in this chronological development from generalization to abstraction to metaphorical. But you see, there's another history here, and that history is of the culture, of the language with a capital L. And the history of scientific discourses reveals new strategies evolving, new ways of organizing the grammar as a resource for making meaning. What has happened in the language is something that we've observed in the sense that going from the congruent, and what is the congruent? We said that's sort of where we talk in terms of processes, right? So they educated girls. What's the process? Educated. And the participants, they are the initiator, girls are the affected. That is saying it as a clause. What is a clause? A clause contains a process. It is the one obligatory element of a clause, the process. Women acquired the vote. What's the verb? Acquire. Who's acquiring? Who's the initiator? Women. What have they acquired? The vote. It's a clause. Now, how do you combine these two ideas together? Logically, you use a conjunction, a relator word, a conjunction. They educated girls, and then women acquired the vote. That's what we would call the clausal way of speaking. The congruent. That's how we grow up talking before we go to school. The incongruent, Halliday calls it the metaphorical, leads to greater nominalization, turning the way of what we're describing into nouns. And so instead of saying they educated girls, we now have the education of girls. We've taken that happening, they educated girls, we've turned it into an event thing. It's a noun phrase. Some in linguistics call it a nominal group. The acquisition of the vote by women. We took a women acquired the vote. We turned it into again, an event thing, a nominal group. Now we have two things, two event things. How are we going to combine them? They can't be combined with a conjunction. Instead, we use a verb now to combine them. What have we done, basically? We've turned this sort of two clauses combined with a conjunction into one clause with one verb. There's been a shift then that's taken place. Now, the point is that this shift has become so much the norm in not just the language of science, but the language of education, academia. Not just that, even if you go into working as a bureaucrat somewhere in government, you're also going to be writing like this. Verbs and adjectives becoming nouns. Educated, education. Conjunctions replaced by verbs and then becomes preceded. At the same time, there's a shift downwards where you had two clauses combined into one clause complex. Now they become one simple clause. And the clauses themselves become phrases. There's just been a general reconfiguration of the language. But then this happens so frequently, so much, that it becomes the way we speak. It's the way we write. That those shifts become so commonplace. They become a drift, a direction of change. The instances become the system. It becomes the way we speak. Quoting David Butt, Halliday's analyses of scientific discourse reveal a broad form of grammatical drift that creates a novel intensity in the way that writers in English can construe experience. A novel intensity, meaning that's new, it's creative, it's innovative, but it becomes so much the way that it becomes so prominent that it becomes the way we speak. There is this drift. So what does that mean? What's happened then in the way we construe the world. There's been a steady drift in the grammar of scientific discourse toward things. You see, the language is making us. We're making language. Yes, we're making meaning, but language is also making us. Things have been foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, relations. This is how we see the world. It's the point that I've been making when we talked about Donald Jung and Susan Rice. The point was that this was the way they talk is the way they see the world. But here we're saying that there's a direction of change in the language. Well, that is going to have an impact on how we construe the world. Our language, we make language, but it is also making us. Now, how did this all come about? Why did it come about? As the need arose for more powerful abstract theories of experience, how you construe the world. When science came along, there were needed to be new ways to see the world. And in order to accommodate these developments in our knowledge and in the way that we talked about the world, we've been empowered by the metaphor-making potential of language. And what is the metaphor-making potential of language? The ability to reconstrue, this I'm quoting from Halliday, to reconstrue common sense reality into one that imposed regularities on experience and brought the environment more within our power to control it. You see, when you turn the verbs into nouns, they become fixed, they become static, they become something you can measure, you control. You're changing the world in a direction that gives you power to control. Control it enough to be able to conduct a scientific experiment and be able to discuss the results. The point is that when we say the shift becomes a drift, we're talking about probabilities. And the probability that you're going to be turning a verb into a noun, well, becomes all the more greater when you're talking science or when you're even writing for any other subject in the university. There is a particular significance in the probabilistic shifts in the lexicogrammatical system. It is the language of science. It is verbal science. And I don't want to be limiting it to, it's not just biology, it's not just chemistry, it's not just physics. It's linguistics, it's sociology, it's psychology. Now let's take it out of verbal science. We're coming to what I want to talk about today, and that is verbal art. And we're going to be looking at it from the point of view of another scholar in linguistics. Her name is Ruqaiya Hasan. David Budd is saying this, for Hasan, for this particular scholar, it is the intervention of the writer in mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. That is what I'm going to be explaining to you today. In what sense this idea of metaphor, creating, developing the language of science, all right? Now, that represents, Halliday is saying, is sort of the probabilistic shifts, the drifts, all right? But when it comes to metaphor in verbal art, it becomes something quite different. It is the intervention of the writer in mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency. And that's what I'm going to explain. Our discussion is going to be on verbal art. And I'm going to be relying on a particular scholar. I mentioned her just now, Ruqaiya Hasan. She is, in fact, the wife of Professor M.A.K. Halliday. Professor Hassan is a scholar very much in her own right. Their ideas are similar, as we will see. And I believe I mentioned before that my interest in this whole idea of verbal art, verbal science, is very much derived from a book project that Professor Halliday and Professor Hassan, before they passed away, began. And after Professor Hassan passed away, Professor Halliday asked me and Professor David Butt to continue. And with Professor Halliday and Professor Hassan both having passed away recently, this book project has now become sort of the basis of the course that I'm presenting here to you. So I'm going to be looking at, Halliday was very much interested in the language of science. Professor Hassan is very much interested in the language of verbal art. And this book honestly made a great impression on me. Linguistics, language, and verbal art. It influenced very much the way I look at language, that I look at verbal art. First of all, what Hassan is saying is that there are two orders of meaning, two levels of meaning that are ongoing. The first order of meaning is what we normally observe. It is what we would call the semantics, the lexigrammar, phonology. They all come together, create the verbalization, the way we speak, the way we talk. Okay, so this is the first order of meaning. First order of meaning is the most obvious. Is the one that we see there. It's on the surface, all right? But our point is that there is a deeper meaning. When we get to verbal art, and by verbal art, poetry, drama, it can be in books, it can be in movies. There is another layer. There is a deeper meaning. How is that deeper meaning conveyed? How does it come through? How is it achieved? Hassan is saying that it is achieved by something called symbolic articulation. I want you to think of symbolic as being metaphorical. That is, metaphors are really symbols, all right? Symbolic articulation, Hassan says, it is where the meanings of language are turned into signs having a deeper meaning. What is symbolic articulation? I think I'm going to pause here. We will take a break. It's now about 12:47. Before I go farther, I'm going to stop here. We'll take a pause and we'll begin at the top of the hour. And I noticed that there have been some things on the chat. I'll take a look at those and reply, if not on the chat, in the next hour. All right, so we'll resume again at 1 o'clock. All right, so let's pause for a moment here. Okay, everyone, let's begin again. And a few things from the chat. I've commented on some and replied, but not everything. First of all, the book is Linguistics, Language, Verbal Art. Strongly recommend it. It really changed my perception of poetry. All right. It gave me an insight into how poetry is meaningful that honestly I did not have before I came across this book. It's influenced my own scholarship as well. And I mean, I have my own book on verbal art, but very much influenced by Professor Rukai Hassan's work here. Some questions. First of all, about the videos. When I download them from Zoom, I do some editing because some of the, I've forgotten sometimes to I've included the breaks, and so I try to cut those out and so forth. So some of the extra parts I edit out and then put the video on my YouTube channel. So for the announcements about the videos, I put them. I'll upload them in an announcement to Canvas after the class, after I've been able to download, make some editing, and then upload to YouTube. All right, so on my YouTube channel, then you'll be able to find the videos for this course. And again, I'll mention it every time. I'll give you the links in Canvas afterwards. All right. All right, so, and the other point was some of you have mentioned that in looking at the PDF version of the PowerPoint, you don't see some things. Well, yes, some things are there in the PowerPoint that are sort of dynamic, and those obviously don't come through in the PDF version. PDF version only presents sort of some aspects of it, all right? It's what we could call, it is not the dynamic, all right, that PowerPoint is. Okay, so let's come back to what we're talking about. And I just, oh, those of you that were, you asked about the assignment, exam, test, and so forth. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of class today, please go to the folder for lecture 1 in this course, and I have uploaded a document, and in that document I listed out what were the questions that were used in the midterm and in the final, and the term paper assignment, just to give you, so you do have an idea of the kinds of questions that I have asked in the past. I will not repeat them in the future, but nonetheless, it gives you an idea of the way, the nature of the tests. All right, so to just address that question on chat. And now I will try not to pay attention to what's on the chat. If you do have any questions or comments and you put them on chat, fine, I'll reply to them in the break. All right, but I'll try not to be distracted by it during the time. But please, by no means should you take that as discouraging you from putting stuff on chat as it comes to your mind. Please do so throughout the lecture as I'm speaking. I'll just go back through the chat, and if I seem to have missed something that you've asked and I didn't reply to it, please just enter it again. Okay, I do try to go through it and see if there's anything, then try to respond to it. All right, so good. Let's carry on. 2 orders of meaning I mentioned. All right, so I think the first order is just you're listening to me now, that is the verbalization, what I'm saying to you. Am I communicating to you poetry, verbal art? No. All right, it is a straightforward lecture, so there is a first order of meaning. But when it comes to poetry, when it comes to, and I don't mean just poetry, any kind of verbal art, and this could be what unfolds in a movie as well, and we'll take a look at an example of that, Murder on the Orient Express. Yes, there is a craft behind it. There is an art. And what is the basis of this art? Hassan is saying it is where the signs are turned into a deeper meaning is through a process she calls symbolic articulation. Now, what is symbolic articulation? We're going to take a look at some illustrations of that, all right? Well, first of all, it is, as Professor David Butt described before, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, the way we habitually use language, okay? The choices that you make, into a non-habitual consistency. Let's give a word for this. The word that we're going to use is foregrounding. And you see a picture there of like a forest, and you see a sort of a white line, obviously we would take to be a waterfall, all right? No. What's the background for that picture? The background is those trees, all right? They fill it out, all right? But strikingly, there's that sort of white line in the center there, which stands out. It's foregrounded. It's brought to the fore. It's brought to the front. And so you take that sort of the background is what is repeated. It is this patterning that occurs so common. Against that, though, is something that stands out that doesn't fit that pattern. What we're going to be saying is that it is mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, taking something that we habitually do and do it in a non-habitual way. All right? Now, what's the purpose of foregrounding? I'll give you some examples of foregrounding in a moment, so just hold on for that thought, all right? But what is the purpose? Why? Why is this done? To create a theme, to create a motif, an idea. Hassan puts it this way: the purpose of the one who crafts this deeper meaning, the one who's engaged in symbolic articulation, which is really a kind of foregrounding, it is with the purpose of putting forward, projecting a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. It has a meaning. It's a hypothesis. It's what that writer is trying to convey to you. It's their theory about the world. There's a meaning. There's a deeper meaning. Now, Hassan says this: theme is the message of an instance of verbal art. It's the message. Now, if as a reader, one failed to get it, then the work has not been read so as to facilitate engagement in public discourse on verbal art. And you missed the point. If, as a serious student of verbal art, if you are really interested in understanding the art, one cannot engage in discourse on how the theme was symbolically articulated via verbalization. Then one's assessment of the work will fall way below the standard required for teaching literature as an academic discipline. In other words, unless you can, what she's saying is, unless you can see how this theme was symbolically articulated through language, via verbalization, through language, you just have not got the point at all. And that's not, don't say that you're teaching literature if what you're missing is how this theme is articulated, symbolically articulated, the meaning that's being conveyed, this hypothesis. But she goes on to say this. She says this does not necessarily mean that theme is what initially engages the reader. In other words, you may not notice it. It may pass you by. You may not see it. But if it is truly verbal art, the theme is what is going to stay in your mind long after the pleasure of encountering the artistic turn of phrases has dissipated itself, long after you know and you remember and appreciate the art. If it is truly accomplishing its purpose, it's going to stick in your mind. It's going to be what you remember. And it may not be what you initially noticed. It may not be there. You may not see it, but it is communicating to you nonetheless. Even the most assiduous student of verbal art cannot retain the actual patterning of language patterns at the verbalization level of specific works. No, you cannot retain, she says. You cannot remember how the language is, what the language is doing. But if the ideological message of the work has spoken to the reader, who him or herself is obviously not ideologically innocent, then the theme impression will last. Has the ideological message spoken to you, the reader? You see, I'm not saying Donald Jung's speech, and I go back to that, I'm not saying that was verbal art, but it was crafted with a purpose. It does communicate an ideological message. Does it speak to you? Do you catch on? Did you get the point? Things are in the saddle and ride mankind. That is a theme. That is his hypothesis. Now, that is what he was doing in his speech. But what we're saying is that when you look at an instance of verbal art, poetry, or in a movie, in drama, or whatever, there's a message there. Do you recognize the message? Does it speak to you? Now, there's been some criticism of linguistics approaching literature. You'll find in many universities, you have those that work on literature and those that work on language, linguistics. And it's almost like the two will never see eye to eye. Hassan writes this: there's a widespread feeling that by adopting precise linguistic techniques and terminology for the analysis of literary language, one would be gaining a trivial accuracy without gaining any deeper insight into the nature of literature as a distinct kind of language activity. In other words, it's thought by some that a linguistic analysis of verbal art is basically gaining a trivial accuracy. Yes, you've found some statistics. Yes, you've seen some patterns, but you are not getting at the deeper insight into what this piece of verbal art is about. And obviously, that is not what she is saying. She's taking a very different point of view. Now, she understands, she's sympathetic with that view. She says, to a certain extent, this impression has been strengthened by recent trends in stylistics where often linguists have equated style with frequency tables and cited ungrammaticality as an associated feature for some genres of literary register. In other words, yeah, she's saying, to some extent it's true. Some who've been engaged in linguistics and the study of literature, which very often is called stylistics, what they've been doing with their sort of looking at patterns and devising tables and so forth, and even noticing that, oh, such and such is ungrammatical in their use, and that defines the style. She's saying, yes, she can almost sympathize with those who consider that a trivial pursuit. Now, someone else writing from a different perspective, from a literary perspective, on Ruqaiya Hasan, says this. This is Lance St. John Butler, and it's from his book indicated there, Registering the Difference, Reading Literature Through Register. And he writes this: Ruqaiya Hasan, perhaps the strongest Hallidaean of them all, has devoted some time to the topic of the specifically literary. In her paper, The Place of Stylistics in the Study of Verbal Art, and her book, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art, she makes an intriguing compromise between the linguistic gospel of Halliday and the special concessions needed to deal with the phenomena of literature. Okay, what is her intriguing compromise? He continues, Hassan's work is a good first step towards the sort of liberation we need. She is aware that a linguistic analysis of a text, stylistics in action, is a vast undertaking. Even as simple a sentence as Robert Frost's "I wonder about the trees" needs exhaustive analysis at the levels of semantics, syntax, lexicon, phonology, and she imagines the innumerable tables listing frequencies of tokens of different types from the various levels of language. But she rejects this method. And she objects that without any hypothesis, one can do very little with such tables. How could one form an interpretation from them? Straight linguistic analysis can say nothing about the text as art. Yeah, it's true. This straight linguistic analysis, yes. But what Hassan is saying, though, is that what are you looking for? You're looking for the hypothesis of the one who crafted the piece. And what you're looking for then is the evidence in the use of symbolic articulation that is indeed the hypothesis. In other words, what is theme in the sense that Hassan is speaking about it? Theme is the hypothesis. I'm noticing, can I just ask you, there seems to be, I'm just noticing on the chat, and sorry for the distraction, but I am concerned for that. Someone says that the theme, that the screen is vague. I am watching it as well on another screen, just to make sure that everything is working all right. And so far, I see it all right, and I just wonder how the rest of you, are you seeing it all right? Can I just get some feedback from you? Okay, so then if most of you are getting it all right, then at least on this side, okay, it's working all right. And that's I can't just, I think it will depend on both my side and your side as far as whether it comes through. But it's so far, it seems that for many of you, it seems to be working all right. So let's continue. All right. What's theme then? Theme, in the sense that Hassan is speaking about it, is a hypothesis. As she puts it, is a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. So her point is this: the patterns of language are so deployed as to take us in a particular direction. Each message is a message by itself, but the totality of these messages enunciates a theme. It is the total work itself. The theme becomes accessible by an examination of A, the meaning of the individual messages, B, guided by the repatterning of patterns. A literary artifact is an extended metaphor. How is the metaphor created? The metaphor is created by basically creating a pattern, a direction in which the way the language is being constructed, and then at certain points, breaking that pattern, deviating from that pattern. And in deviating from that pattern that has been created in that example of verbal art, what one is doing is trying to convey a message, highlight a message. That message is the theme. And what is that theme? That theme is the hypothesis about some aspect of social life. Now, it's similar to what Mears was saying. Mears said this: the words of the poem are used in a symbolic way, having more than a single meaning. The effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way. It is the way, the idea, it's the combination of ways in which we use language to evoke a sense of reality that none of them possess alone. The nature of this reality is not precise, it is indefinite. See, it's not just about the words, it's about the wordings that are used, the patterns that are created. Patterns are deployed in such a way as to take us in a particular direction. The totality of these messages enunciates a theme. It is this metaphoric cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. That partially glimpsed personal reality, that is the theme. That is the hypothesis that is being conveyed in that piece. And how it is being portrayed is through the use of metaphor. Metaphor, in the sense of what is created, is a pattern. And against that pattern is foregrounded some sort of change and deviation and repatterning of the patterns.
In the end, it's been useful because I now see the structure of mind as like the structure of a poem.
Okay, yes. Would you say it's a healing prospect for you, writing poetry?
I would say it is, yeah, absolutely. And I became particularly interested in a poet called Wallace Stevens, who's a kind of not very well-known poet, but amongst critics, he's regarded as one of the three great poets of the English language in the 20th century. And he basically admitted that writing poetry through his life had a healing purpose. It was a therapeutic function.
Hassan says much the same thing. She talks about what she calls a socio-therapeutic function of the study, reading of literature. To make readers more human than they were before they came to read that literature. To really change people's perspective on things. This is what motivated Hassan to carry out the study that she did. She explains.
Well, I was always interested in literature, and up to the time that I did my own study, postgrad study at Edinburgh, up to that time, in fact, I went into that study because I was convinced of the therapeutic, socio-therapeutic function of the study of literature. That literature, the teaching of literature could be such that it could make the readers more human than they are before they came to reading that literature, you know. So I always felt that you could really change people's perspective on things by teaching literature properly.
And so what is the theme? Theme is the hypothesis. You see, what we're really after is verbal art is not just the craft. There's a message. And what is that message that is being attempted to be conveyed, projected? This, the authors, the crafters' own personal, partially glimpsed personal reality, as Mears puts it. How does that come through in what you see? And this is what I really, my goal is in teaching this, is that what you begin to see is that it's not just about the words on the page, and it's not just the artistry, so to speak, it's the message. And how does that message come across? You see, that's what impressed me. That's honestly, you know, when before I read that particular book, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art, I never really was that interested in poetry, honestly. It sort of passed me by. It sort of didn't, I didn't see the point of it. But then I began to realize that those who write it, there is a craft behind it. There is an art behind it. There is a deeper meaning. It's not just the verbalization. It's not just that first order meaning. There's a second order of meaning that's being conveyed. And that indeed, through a kind of linguistic analysis, we can indeed begin to see something of how the resources of language have been taken and used by the one who is the artist to convey something that we didn't even really see before. All right, take this poem, Road Not Taken. Some of you probably have seen it before, all right? Listen to the poem as it is read.
Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference.
Okay, so what is the theme of this particular poem? What is the hypothesis?
Now, another addition to our NewsHour bookshelf. We look at a new take on a long-admired American poem. Arts correspondent Jeffrey Brown has that.
Two roads diverged in a yellowed wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler, long I stood. The first lines of one of the best-known American poems by one of the nation's best-loved poets, Robert Frost. It's called The Road Not Taken, and that's the title of a new book that calls it the poem everyone loves and almost everyone gets wrong. Author David Orr is poetry columnist for the New York Times Book Review and joins us now. Welcome to you. So it's read as a kind of pay on to individualism.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's why you see it in so many graduation speeches. That's why you see it in commercials. I mean, there's no company in the world that would put the poem up as part of their commercial if they knew what the poem is more likely to mean.
Which is what?
Okay, which is what? I mean, the idea is that what is it about? And can we say, can I say that's what the poem's about, but you're wrong, all right, in how you understand it. And so many got it wrong. Remember, first thing, what we're talking about here is a theory, a hypothesis. not only the hypothesis of the one who crafted it and their hypothesis about some aspect of social man, but we're also, in our interpretation, coming up with a hypothesis about what we think it means. All right? And what do you do with a hypothesis? You have to have some evidence for proving or disproving a hypothesis, right? Now that's, where does the evidence going to come from? The evidence is going to come from language itself. And that's what we are engaged in doing here. Yes, we are trying to come up with a hypothesis. We are remembering, though, very clearly that what we are devising and what we are coming up with is indeed a hypothesis. I would not be so sure to say that someone else is wrong, but I would say that this was the meaning that got conveyed to me. Okay, let's come back to this. Frost, the road not taken. This is what Hassan said about it. Read with an understanding of its deepest meaning will leave an impression of the theme. And for her, the theme is this: the immutability of human choice. Made lightly, because through the thick curtain of the present it appeared less than momentous, that choice that we made lightly, because through the thick curtain of the present it appeared less than momentous, the realization comes too late that the lightly made choice has indeed made all the difference. The immutability of human choice. This, she is saying that she believes to be the theme. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to examine how she came to that point of view. And how we're going to do that is we're going to go back and we're going to look at sort of the approach that we're going to take to this. That there are meanings, and these meanings are realized through choices of wording. Yeah, we said the experiential, the kinds of process that are taking place, who initiates those processes, who is affected by those processes. What are the circumstances? Okay? This is what we're going to focus on then. We're going to focus on both the experiential and the logical. And when we talk about the experiential, when we talk about the processes, when we said that there are different process types. There's doing, there's sensing, there's saying, there's behaving, existing, relating, being, becoming, having. And there are different participant roles. In a doing process, there is the actor or the agent, and it's being done to the goal. It's being carried, the action is being carried forward to the goal, the affected. In a mental process, it is the sensor and what has been sensed, what was known, the phenomena, and so on, all right? Now we're going to sort of generalize a bit here. We're going to generalize into two categories: the ER roles and the ED roles. The ER roles, who is the initiator of the action, okay? Doer, the ER role. The ED role, who is the affected, all right? What is in a mental process, what is seen, all right? The ED role. Now, in systemic function linguistics, we call that the system of transitivity. Now, Hassan takes it another step forward. And what she is suggesting is that the processes and that are being presented, some are more dynamic than others. So in terms of the participant roles, if you have a process with an actor and a goal, in that case, then you have something which is more dynamic than something which describes just an attribute. Tom is thin. That's not so dynamic. If you say Tom is thin, but if you say Tom hit the ball, that's more dynamic. All right. So, and she is arranging then these sort of participant roles in this sort of Klein, or this continuum from dynamic to non-dynamic. And what occurs then in this particular poem is what I've highlighted here. We have actors with a goal, someone who does something to something else. We have some actors that there is no second participant. We have those that say something, but not to anyone else. We have the censor, we have the carrier. All right, so in looking at these, it does seem pretty obvious. Yes, an actor with a goal, like the example I just made, Tom hit the ball, all right? In that sense, the actor with a goal, that's, yes, quite dynamic, as opposed to a carrier with some attribute. Tom is thin, all right, so. And if we go through then and look at these and assign these throughout the poem. So if I say two roads diverged, that is an actor, but there is no second participant. Travel, stand, bend, want, lay, diverge, all right, at the end. All right, so you have those that are sort of the actor without a second participant. Then you have the actor with a second participant, took the other, warned them, trod in black, kept, took, make, all right. Now that's then throughout the poem. We have some that are like the verb to be. We have some that are sensing processes, look, no doubt, all right. All right, so now let's take a look. Is there any patterning that can be observed, keeping this in mind? All right, this sort of Klein of more dynamic and non-dynamic, ranging down to non-dynamic. And what she does is she takes, for example, the participant I, all right, first person. And the first person throughout the poem, what verbs are engaged in by the first person? Travel, stand, take, keep, and so on. You can see the list here, all right? Of these, we notice that there are two, only two, which are dynamic, really dynamic. Take, occurring twice, and keep. The rest of these are less so. And so Hassan makes the observation, she says, the non-dynamic nature of the protagonist. The only dynamic action that he makes is taking the road. It's the choice that was made. That is the only dynamic action, and that is foregrounded. That one single dynamic action, making that choice. But the rest of the actions are basically, it's against a background of non-dynamic activity. The other participant is the road. The road diverged, bent, wanted, lay, and some relational processes. The roads themselves, no effect. They simply are. They are the medium. In other words, they are yes, they're a participant in a single participant process, but they are not an agent that carries out some action to something else. So the roads themselves exercise no effect, ineffectual. So Hassan takes it a step further. She says the universe that is being set up by this poem is one in which a dynamic role does not appear to be assigned either the I of the poem or the roads, both appearing equally incapable of affecting the world around them. Now, other other actors, we could say. Interestingly, notice something about this. Anonymous acts disassociated from the actors of the act. How do you do that? In other words, we don't know who really wore down that path. We don't know who's trotting on that path. It is anonymous. And it's anonymous because it's been turned into nouns. Though as for that, the passing there, the passing is what wears them down. You turned that activity, that happening, into a something, the passing. And both that morning equally lay in leaves. No step had trodden black. No step had trodden black. No step. Again, you're not representing it even as verbs. You're representing these actions as nouns. And by doing so, they are not carried about by anyone. They are completely anonymous, but they are very much affecting the paths that lay before this actor. The environment then is influenced by anonymous, faceless beings. We don't know them. They're not even really engaged. It is the happenings themselves with someone who is doing it. They aren't even there. It's now turned into something, nouns. The only effectual thing is the anonymous, timeless, passing steps, but it's all influence. The only effectual thing here is carried out by something that is now turned into nouns, which completely remove the possibility of identifying who it is that is doing it. All right, there's another element here, which is the logical. And when I talk about logical meaning, let me give some background to this, all right? Logical meaning. When we expand on an idea, do we expand on it symmetrically? We call that parataxis. Okay, John enjoys reading and he likes swimming. All right, so I have a sequence here of two ideas, all right? Symmetrical, even. They are equal grammatically. We say that's parataxis. The relationship is paratactic. In this relationship, though, it is asymmetrical. This is my father. That's the main idea. That is the alpha clause. And the dependent clause is modifying it. It's pointing back with this arc to the main clause. It is the beta clause. Who is teaching here? It cannot stand alone. They are asymmetric. They are not equal in terms of their grammatical standing. We call that hypotaxis. Now, I want to illustrate the fact that this sort of logical expansion can be extremely important in terms of the meaning that it conveys. And I'm going to illustrate this with an example from Obama's speech. And it was at the end of his speech, and it is one sentence, which expands into so many clauses. Now, when he expands into all these clauses, there has to be some sort of logical structuring to these clauses.
This is our chance to answer that call. This is our moment. This is our time to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace, to reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth that out of many we are one, that while we breathe we hope, and where we are met with cynicism and doubt and those who tell us that we can't, we will respond with that timeless creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
Now, I want to focus on, as we go through it, You notice that he has a number of different levels here. He expands into, first of all, to put our people back to work and open doors of opportunity for our kids. He repeats that pattern. Two ideas, to do this and do this. The next one, to restore prosperity and promote the cause of peace. This is the same pattern. To reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth. They are paratactic. Each is joined by and. Do this and do this. Do this and do this. Now, he repeats this 3 times. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Then he expands on that out of many we are one, that while we breathe, we hope. And he carries on. Again, 1, 2, 3. You notice that the use of the sort of the logical structuring allowed him to create this sort of rhythm, which has almost a musical quality about it. So it's, and you'll notice that his voice, it got louder. It began to, there was a crescendo, and he talks faster. Why? That is helped by the logical structuring here. So it has a particular, it contributes to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You see, the logical does enter into how we receive it. Now, this is not the first time Obama did this. There's another speech that he gave as well. And this was a speech that he gave early on in his sort of political rise, all right? And in this speech, which in fact was given on a night in which he sort of was considered the one who had lost. And he gave this speech, and it's regarded as probably one of his best. In fact, it inspired will.i.am and he created this Emmy Award-winning music video. In other words, he turned the speech into music. And how could he do that? He could do it because the way in which that speech was being expressed relied on the logical structuring. Let's listen to it.
We know the battle ahead will be long, but always remember that no matter what obstacles stand in our way, nothing can stand in the way of the power of millions of voices calling for change. We have been told we cannot do this by a chorus of cynics, and they will only grow louder and more dissonant in the weeks and months to come. We've been asked to pause for a reality check. We've been warned against offering the people of this nation false hope. But in the unlikely story that is America, there has never been anything false about hope. For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we've been told we're not ready, or that we shouldn't try, or that we can't, generations of Americans have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and abolitionists as they blazed the trail toward freedom. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It was sung by immigrants as they struck out to the shores, pioneers pushed westward against unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. It was the call of workers organized
women who reached for the ballots. A president who chose the moon as our new frontier. And a king who took us to the mountaintop and pointed the way to the promised land.
Yes, we can with justice and equality. Yes, we can to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can heal this nation. Yes, we can repair this world. Yes, we can. And so tomorrow, as we take the campaign south and west, as we learn that the struggles of the textile workers in Spartanburg are not so different than the plight of the dishwasher in Las Vegas, that the hopes of the little girl who goes to the crumbling school in Dillon are the same as the dreams of the boy who learns on the streets of LA.
We will remember that there's something happening in America.
That we are not as divided as our politics suggest. That we are one people. That we are one nation. And together we will begin the next great chapter in the American story with 3 words that will ring from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Thank you, New Hampshire. Thank you.
Now notice how this was constructed, especially the last sentence here. Notice the repetition, as we take, as we learn. As we learn that the struggles, that the hopes, you have a pair, and then you have another pair. We will remember. Later on, 47M, together we will begin. And that we will remember that there is something, that we are not as divided, that we are one people. This repetition, pairs and triplets, and how they're combined together as we learn, as we take, that's paratactic, that pairing, and then another pair, that the struggles, that the hopes. Now all of that part at the beginning here is sort of hypotactically pre-modifying what follows, and that is the main idea. We will remember 3 things: that there is something, that we are not as divided, that we are one people, that we are one nation. Do you see there's a structuring here? There's a structuring, there's an evenness about it in terms of the pairing of items. And that structuring there is what gives it that sort of, that eloquence, that it obviously is crafted in to the speech. It contributes to the fact that then it is almost considered like, as I said, music. Now you come back to look at the poem that we were looking at, and you realize that, in fact, yes, it's not just 2 roads that diverged. The poem splits. It almost splits right down the middle here. You'll notice that how does it begin? 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. And sorry, I could not travel both. And notice how then it ends at the very end. 2 roads diverged in a wood. I took the one less traveled by. There's a symmetry here. How it begins is how it ends, and it almost divides into 2 parts. At the beginning part, I took, and the second part, I kept. Hassan mapped out the structuring here, and I'm not going to go into all the detail of her mapping and how she mapped it, but you'll notice the 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. It breaks down into, you have 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. Then you have a second part. And then you have a third part. Now that's in the first half. Now notice that in the second half, I kept the first for another day, exclamation mark. A second part, ending in full stop. And a third part, again, 1 sentence, full stop. There is a symmetry, there's a balance here. Not only is it 2 roads, the poem itself projects this idea of symmetry, projects this idea of 2 halves, 2 roads. It begins, two roads diverge, it ends. Notice how the second part of that, then I took the other, captured in the third. I hope I'm getting across the point. Notice that there is a craft in the poetry itself, that in the poem itself, it also projects metaphorically. What did Hassan say? The literary artifact is an extended metaphor. And so you have two roads diverging in yellow wood. That's the beginning of the first part on the first half of the poem. The last part, I took the other, then I took the other. And how does it end? And that has made all the difference. Summing up then, two alternatives presented themselves. The attributes that are described here, the attributes of these two roads, the one not taken, the other that the writer took. Two alternatives presented themselves. But there was no choice but to choose. There's no real basis for the choice. Equally lay. The choice itself is imposed by the simple fact that there are the two roads. The choice taken blocked out the other choice. The consequence, though, of that choice, everlasting. Two roads, indistinguishable. The taking of one without any real justification. That is what I shall be telling this. That is what this poem is about. And that choice, and that has made all the difference. Explicitly creating, making, the choice itself. I is not a very volitional, active participant, the protagonist itself. The roads know. Every action is carried out by some anonymity. What is the only thing here that in fact is a very explicit material process of creating? That. And what is that? The taking of that choice, making of the choice. You see, the point is that what we're doing is we're looking for in the poem, where you can see it, though, not just in poetry, it's in the speeches that we can see as well. It is the use of language to create a patterning. But in this case, it was a pattern. The background to this was sort of an inactivity, and which would then make it stand out, the activity of choosing. And it was the choice, the immutability of that choice and the consequences that it had. You see, Hassan, what she has done is she has used the evidence from the way the language is being used to argue for her hypothesis. And what she's saying is, we have a hypothesis about what is this poem about. And then we look at language to see, to prove or to disprove. What evidence can we find? So her conclusion, Frost, The Road Not Taken, read with an understanding of its deepest message, will leave an impression of the theme, the immutability of human choice. Made lightly because through the thick curtain of the present it appeared less than momentous. The realization comes too late that the lightly made choice has made all the difference. This was her hypothesis. And linguistics itself is there to, we are looking at how the writer's deeper meaning was conveyed through the resources of language. When we say symbolic articulation, how the metaphor, how this extended metaphor was articulated, how it was expressed through language. And it is through taking those patterns, it is taking the way that we use language, creating patterns, and then breaking those patterns at certain points to highlight, to foreground the meaning that is being conveyed. A literary artifact is an extended metaphor. All right, I'm sorry, I've gone beyond what I would normally like to do before taking a break. I realize I've gone, I think, let's see, checking it's 2 o'clock. All right, sorry, I normally would give you before, but I didn't want to end before I got through that whole poem. I didn't want to break it up. 2 o'clock now. Can we carry on at 2:10, please? All right, 2:10. 10-minute break, and we'll carry on from there. All right. Thank you. Okay, everybody, let's carry on for the final hour for today. And as I said, I will keep a little bit of time at the end for those of you that have not yet done the survey, get to know you survey, which last time I looked was about almost half of you. Some have asked if you're in another of my classes and you have done it for that class, do you need to do it here? No, you don't. And but that would only be very few of you. And so I will ask ask you to do that later. And again, for those of you that have been joining us for the first time this week, the slides at the beginning, I did mention about the assessment and and the tasks and so forth that need to be done. And as I said, because I know you'd like to get some idea what the midterm test would look like, what the exam kinds of questions that I would ask. So please look at that document in the folder for week 1. And that'll give you some idea what to expect. The continuous participation is important, okay? As I mentioned to you, it entails 4 tasks, each of them 5 points, writing 150 to 200 words by a specified deadline. And by the way, that deadline is the 14th of September. It's a Monday, not a Friday. So it's a Monday. Please take note of that. Please be sure to get it in by the deadline, all right? And responding to one of the questions that I asked. And that's not much to do. But it's in the end going to be very helpful to you to at least, it is fully possible for you to get the full 20% of this continuous participation by doing the 4. But it will affect your grade if you don't bother doing the assessments or any of the assessments. So please do so. And along the way, if you have questions, then please be sure to let me know. Please be sure to ask. Okay, we have been looking at verbal art. We've been looking at Professor Ruqaiya Hasan's approach to it. There is a poem that she analyzes in that book that I've been mentioning, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art. Honestly, it was this particular chapter that really impacted me, all right? So let me share it with you. It's a poem written by an Australian poet, Les Murray. It's entitled The Widower in the Country. I'll read it. I'll get up soon and leave my bed unmade. I'll go outside and split off kindling wood from the yellow box log that lies beside the gate. And the sun will be high, for I get up late now. I'll drive my axe in the log and come back in with my armful of wood and pause to look across the Christmas paddocks aching in the heat, the windless trees, the nettles in the yard. And then I'll go in, boil water, and make tea. This afternoon, I stood out on the hill and watched my house away below, and how the roof reflects the sun and makes my eyes water and close on bright web visions smeared on the dark of my thoughts to dance and fade away. The sun will move on, and I will simply watch or work or sleep, and evening will draw in. Coming on dark, I'll go home, light the lamp, eat my corned beef supper sitting there at the head of the table. Then I'll go to bed. Last night I thought I dreamed. But when I woke, the screaming was only a possum skiing down the iron roof on little moonlit claws. All right. What's the poem about? It seems to be, in terms of just what's described here, just sort of the daily routine of this widower who clearly lives by himself. Widower, so his wife has passed away. It seems to be sort of, just his daily, mundane, routine life. Is that all that this poem is about? That's the question that we're asking, right? That's the question that we're posing now. That is there a deeper meaning to this poem? Okay, so I'm going to come back to what we talked about earlier. Let's look at it from the point of view of what we call the system of transitivity, the choice of process, the choice of participants. Okay, let's see. And we're going to do, this is in fact what Hassan did in her analysis. She generalized those categories of those that are in the ER role as opposed to those that are in the ED role. Okay, now, who is the initiator? Who is the affected? And she puts it in this sort of table and looks at it, and from this standpoint of view, all right, so if I take a look at, in terms of the ER role here, I have various participants mentioned in the poem. I have the widower, obviously. There is one animate being, the possum, which is mentioned at the end. There are some objects that are mentioned, the yellow box log, the paddocks, the roof. There's a mention of time in the sense of the sun and the evening, all right? And there is an event, the screaming. So those are really the only participants that are mentioned in this particular poem. The widower is mentioned a lot as the actor, meaning that these are doing processes, right? He is also the censor. He thinks, he behaving, sleeping, dreaming, waking. Let's add these up, quantify it a bit. If I said, what's in terms of who is the doer, in terms of these participants, the background, the pattern that we see emerging throughout the poem is the widower is the actor, the censor, the behavior, and so forth. All right, so in other words, 28 occurrences of the widower. We have one mention from the possum. We have the 6 mentions with respect to the object, and so on. So then what we could say is that anything other than the widower is foregrounded. Got it? All right, so now you don't just do this for one thing, right? We're going to take a look because it's also a consistency. All right, now another point would be that in terms of the kinds of process, that we can see that from the idea of who is the actor. That's obviously doing, censor, saying. Okay, so in terms of kinds of process, doing process, 27 mentions, as opposed to 1 related to sensing, 8 for behaving, and 3 for relating. So again, what is the background? The background is what occurs like that forest of trees. And what is foregrounded is anything else that occurs. So the sensing, the behaving, the relating, those are foregrounded. All right, now come back to the other aspect, the logical, how the clauses are combined and so forth. Something interesting. If I take a look at those clauses, those sentences that combine parataxis, you remember what parataxis is, right? Hypotaxis and embedding, in other words, like post modifiers, all within the same sentence. Where does that occur? And I've highlighted here. I can see where, in fact, this occurs. Where do we notice that all 3 occur? And we can see where it occurs in the poem. Well, there's something else here, and that is, what is the, as you look at the poem, what's the poem, the conjunction that is mentioned most of the time? And then, and. Well, that is the background. What's foregrounded? Other conjunctions, for, or, but. Tense. What about the tense? Well, notice that most of the tense is, and if you take a look at it on your screen, you'll see the future tense. I'll get up, I'll leave, I'll go, I'll split up. You see, it's so much of it is future. I'll do this, I'll do that. You have some examples of present. You have past in that last sentence. And you have some non-finite verbs as well. And so what are we saying is the background use of future tense. Anything other than future is foregrounded. Now, we've looked at it through these various levels. What we've identified is, in each case, the background, what occurs frequently, the pattern. And then we observe something which is, what should I say, foregrounded. It's something that is different than the background. Now, if I look at it in terms of, now, consistently, where did this foregrounding occur? Where did it involve the choice of, for example, the logical? Where did I combine parataxis, hypotaxis, embedding in the same sentence? Where did the use of the conjunction for, or, but occur as opposed to and? What about the process? Where was it something other than a doing process? Where was it that something else was mentioned at the beginning, the theme in a different sense, though, not theme as in a sense of motif, but the first thing that occurs in the sentence? The foregrounding. What's so interesting about this is that where the foregrounding consistently occurs is what you see here on the screen. All these various elements of foregrounding all center on these 3 sentences. With my arm full of wood, and pause to look across the Christmas paddocks, aching in the heat. Do you notice the use of the word aching here? Next one, the roof reflects the sun and makes my eyes water. What happens when your eyes are watering? It's tears, close on the bright web vision, smeared on the dark of my thoughts to dance and fade away. In other words, the foregrounding is all bringing your attention to where it is aching, dark. The last sentence stands out above all. There, the tense is different. There, so powerfully. Last night I thought I dreamed, but when I woke, the screaming. That one nominalization here, the screaming. Who's screaming? He's dreaming. How does he know who's screaming? How does he know there was a scream? Perhaps it was his own. In other words, what has the poet done? The poet has devised a background by the choices that were made. And against that background has foregrounded various linguistic aspects, but consistently around certain locations. And those locations are where it is aching, the darkness, the screaming. What is your attention being drawn to? Your attention is being drawn to the sorrow of that widower. In what seems to be just sort of this plain, everyday, routine, mundane rundown of what this widower does, what you feel is the pain of that widower. And that's what the poet is directing your attention, where the poet is directing your attention. That is verbal art. Now, when I looked at what Hassan was doing and what she achieved through looking at the language itself and being able to sort of be able to identify the craft behind the art, it interested me to take a look at another poet's art. And specifically, I was interested in looking at the poetry of Edwin Tumbu. Edwin Tumbu, you probably haven't heard of him unless you were Singaporean. In Singapore, he's known as the father of English language poetry. The School of Creative Media here at City U did a special production related to Edwin Tumbu's poetry. And they did a special, this exhibition, and what they developed, they did a show in Shanghai and also here in Hong Kong related to Edwin Tumbu's poetry. This was the Edwin Tumbu Natterson, the Infinite Line. It was done a while back, and but I know Edwin well because before I came to Hong Kong, and that's a long time ago, I taught at the National University of Singapore, and Edwin Tumbu at the time was the head of the Department of English Language and Literature, and he was the dean of the Faculty of Arts. And so I knew him. In fact, he was my boss, all right? And so I knew of his poetry, and I was fascinated to see, well, could I do something similar with his poetry that Hassan did with the example that she had of Les Murray's Widower in the Country? Now, if you've been to Singapore, you must have seen the Merlion, right? And I don't know, though, if you noticed that in front of the Merlion, there is a stand there, and there's a plaque in front of the Merlion. And on this plaque is a poem. The poem is written by, yes, Edwin Tumbu, Ulysses by the Merlion. Edwin Tumbu has made these comments about his poetry. He says, I'm looking at language as part of my life, trying to create, to make my poems, putting language together. Technique, he says, is all about poetry in the making. The chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, the layering. He's an artist, and language is what he crafts. It is the resource that is the basis of his art. Let's take a look at one of his poems. And this was the first poem that I analyzed of his poetry. It's titled "Gods Can Die." And I will play an extract of him reading the poem.
Gods can die. I have seen powerful men undo themselves keep two realities, one for minor friends, one for the powers that be, the really powerful. Such people take a role supporting managers of state, accept an essential part in some minor project. But after a bit of duty that makes them fester with intentions, they play the major figure to old friends. We understand and try to seek a balance in the dark, to know the private from the public monument, to find our way between the private and the public argument, or what can be said, or if a thing is meant, or meant to make amends, is generous or mean. The casual word, the easiness, the quick straight answer, the humane delay, the lack of cautiousness that give ample laughter to our evenings are too simple for these days of power whose nature is to hint, not state. So when one has a chance to talk, the conversation hesitates on the brink of momentous things. He ponders, suggesting by some unremark there was much more to be said. It's a pity. Good men who seek to serve bind themselves unto a cause, then use the fate of nations as a rationale to take their friends aside, to lead themselves into some history. We gain uncertain statesmen, many lose a friend. But I'm glad that others are powerful with compassion, who see before we do what troubles us, and help in kindness, take ignorance in tow. If not for such, we lose our gods who lived, but now are dying in our friends.
By the way, can I ask if you are to check and mute yourself, unless you're saying something, but some of you I think have your microphone on and aren't aware of the fact that you are making noise. Okay, so okay, all right, so come back to the poem. Gods can die. What's the poem about? You'll notice that in the poem there's quite a lot of symmetry. There's quite a lot of duality. What do I mean by that? You see an obvious pattern that emerges of pairing, comparing items, all right? So lexically, there's quite a few pairs. There's major versus minor, private versus public, generous versus mean, gain versus lose, live versus die, hint versus state. So you see a lot of pairs here. All right? There again, it's getting across this idea of symmetry as duality. There is a sense of the duality, truth and falsehood, good and evil, life and death. And so that all comes through in a lot of symmetry, a lot of parataxis. And this is sustained throughout. It's kept on going throughout. There is this repeated apposition of items or opposition. There is addition, there's negation, alternation. You see this throughout the poem. For example, powerful men undo themselves. Well, what's the opposite of undo? Bind. Good men bind themselves. The relaxed spirit of our evening. So what's the opposite of evening? Contrasted with these days of power. So throughout there is this a background that is created through all of these pairs of things that mean something same or something different. This symmetry, this duality, but there's an undercurrent of confusion. There's a contradiction here. It's posed by the title of the poem, Can Gods Die? Now, when I asked Edwin Tumblue about the poem, he explained that the term gods here, he says, refers to the humanistic impulses, the goodness in man. And he goes on to say this in an interview, and was asked about this poem. He said, I believe that ultimately man makes and unmakes his destiny depending on which side of him prevails. What was the background to this poem? Background was he wrote it for a friend of his. It was obviously he had a friend. And that friend got high up in government. And the relationship changed. He was no longer really there was no longer that closeness. There was no longer that friendship. The power had intervened, and the one friend felt quite powerful now and unable to be so friendly with those with whom he had been closely associated before. Now, I broke down the different participants in the poem. Now, what do you see? I, the first person. See, glad, not doing, right? And we, what about we? Well, again, it's understand, seek, know, find. Again, it's more mental. It's not really engaged in, well, the only one that we find is where it is substituted do, is seeking versus losing. But you notice that the powerful men, those that have gone like his friend, are very busy doers. Undo, keep, take, accept, fester, play. Very busy doing. The activity was one of doing. And also, obviously, at the end there, gods lived and are dying. The opposite. Again, that same sort of symmetrical pattern that we've seen. But the real interest here that came through was looking at the logical structuring, the grammar. I have seen powerful men. Then we notice sort of a paratactic combination here. Powerful men undo themselves, keep two realities. It's a pair, their activity. Keep two realities. What about those two realities? One for minor friends, one for the powers that be. Another pair, another level. One for the powers that be, the really powerful. We call that apposition, not opposition, with an A, apposition. Two things that mean much the sort of refer to the same thing. Now notice the layer upon layer of this sort of symmetrical pairing. Continues. Such people take a role supporting managers of states. Such people accept an essential part in some minor project. So it's been completely paratactic, pairing and continuous symmetry is being projected through the way in which these sentences are being combined. Until we get to the end. Now there's the foregrounding. But after a bit of duty that makes them fester with intentions, they play the major figure to old friends. There's hypotaxis. after a bit of duty. And then another clause that makes them fester with intentions, hypotaxis. In other words, the asymmetry is what stands out. That's where's it foregrounded. And what is being foregrounded here? After a bit of duty that makes them fester with intentions. What's fester mean? Fester is like when you have a sore, an infection, and it gets all pussy and like that. That's festering. And that's the picture. The picture that he is pointing you toward is where he is complaining about his friend. Again, carrying on, we understand and try to seek a balance in the dark. Again, the symmetry continues to know the private from the public monument, to find our way between the private and public argument. To find our way between the private and the public argument, or what can be said. Or if a thing is meant, or meant to make amends, is generous or mean. Layer again upon layer of symmetrical pairing of clauses. And then a repetition, again, that's that sort of sequencing of ideas, the casual word, the easiness, the quick straight answer, the humane delay. Simple clause, but with just a continuous sort of sequence of items, a series of items, until again it comes to the end, where again it, notice, highlights and brings to your attention the idea that what has this friend become? And now notice how this poem reads, and that first line here, so when one has a chance to talk. Now, normally when you read this poem for the first time, you carry on because it's on the same line. You say, so when one has a chance to talk, the conversation. You realize then you can't. In fact, the conversation is the subject of the verb that follows. You don't see that the first time you read it. So when you read it the first time, what happens? So when one has a chance to talk, the conversation, and then you realize that you have to split the line. What's the next word? Hesitates. It's exactly what you do. In other words, the poet makes you hesitate, makes you pause right here where he's talking about it. And again, where he's saying about how his friend is acting like, well, yeah, I can't talk to you, I can't speak to you about things I can't tell. Again, all of that is in the hypotaxis. The hypotaxis, the asymmetry, that is all coming through and pointing you in the direction of where, again, he's pointing out how this friend has changed. Gods can die refers to the humanistic impulses, goodness in man. And what he saw was that goodness was disappearing as his friend became more powerful. So there is that sense of symmetry, but against that symmetry is the asymmetry, the hypotaxis, where he's foregrounding and he's drawing your attention to make you realize what that friend had become. All right, I'm going to stop here. It's about 2:43. And the reason I'm going to stop here, it's about 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes. And I'm going to carry on with this next time. What I'd like to ask you to do is I'd like you to go to the Canvas and the survey, and I'd like you in the time remaining to complete the survey, all right? If you haven't already. If you have, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm reading them, and it's helpful to know the makeup of who's in my class, all right? So thank you for doing so. And those of you who haven't, now is your chance to do it. Look back to Canvas to look for announcements, which will inform you of the link for the video for the Zoom session. and continue to pay attention to what's in the folder for each lecture, also in Canvas. All right. So if you have questions, I'll stay on until the end of the hour, and I'm right here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. All right. And I'll be on chat in the meantime. Those of you who haven't done the survey, please do the survey. For those of you who haven't yet done the assignment, now may be a good time to do it. All right. See you next week.